Honestly, Wayne, I don't know why you're in a stew over front-end alignment. You've always handled new service changes okay before.
But this year, things are different, Tech. The Imperial uses a separate body and frame as in the past. But Chrysler, DeSoto, Dodge, and Plymouth have that new unibody construction with a frame subassembly. And then there's the fully unitized construction on the Valiant.
Pardon my big nose, Wayne, but what's biting you about the new car bodies? You'll have very little trouble handling suspension and front-end alignment.
That's what I try to tell him, Scott.
Well, maybe I am getting gray hair over nothing. Or maybe I just need some filling in on what's new.
Not a bad suggestion. Let's review all the new changes that affect front suspension service.
Good idea. And let's cover all of the Chrysler Corporation models. You never can tell which car is going to knock on the door for service. Every technician ought to know the whole line from stem to stern.
I'll buy that, Tech. It's just good business. So, starting with the Imperial, you already know that it still uses the separate frame. Basically, suspension service on the 1960 Imperial is almost the same as it was on the 1959 model. There are some changes in specifications, however, that we'll go into later. Now, Chrysler, DeSoto, Dodge, and Plymouth all feature the new unibody. Box section side members are integral with body members. A frame subassembly carries the front suspension, engine, and transmission.
Doesn't that subassembly affect suspension adjustment?
No more than it ever did, Wayne. Before the frame subassembly is bolted to the body, attachment points are under precise control. That provides proper front-to-rear and side-to-side alignment of the body frame structure. Shims between the body and frame subassembly take care of up and down alignment and horizontal alignment of front and rear. In manufacture, accurate gauges select the exact shimming needed. Unless you notice sheet metal is badly misaligned, there's no need to worry about body and frame subassembly alignment. The four wheels are always positioned in a true running plane when the car travels straight ahead. Now, this goes for any of the three types of body frame construction.
That's very true, Scott. But how about a word on the Valiant construction?
Well, the Valiant is completely unitized. Body sills, pillars, roof rails, side, top, and bottom panels, all are parts of a completely unitized body frame assembly. The only separate bolted-on structure is a support for the engine front mounts and the front suspension lower control arms. It's often called a Camber because of its shape. The lower control arm pivot shaft and strut are attached to the legs of the Camber. The Camber, in turn, is bolted to the side members of the unitized body frame. The torsion bar front anchor, which provides front suspension height adjustment, is part of the lower control arm. The torsion bar rear anchor is integral with the engine rear support member.
Isn't that just opposite the way it is on other models?
Sure, Wayne. But whether you adjust the torsion bar at the front or the rear shouldn't matter. You're still after the correct suspension height.
You're so right, Tech. Let's talk about that adjustment while we're at it. It's an important one for all the new models. That's where front alignment work actually starts. Suspension height's gotta be right to begin with. Then the front end must be properly aligned. Now, both steps are important or the owner has trouble with braking, handling, riding comfort, and tire life.
Okay. Do we still measure front-end height without passengers or other load?
Yeah, but the car must have a full tank of gas, or weight in the luggage compartment equal to that. 1 gallon of gas weighs 6.5 pounds.
Don't forget to inspect suspension and steering parts for looseness, wear, or damage. Tires, too, must be inflated to recommended pressure. And remember to park the car on a level floor. Suspension and springs must be at normal driving position before any measuring is done. So jounce the rear, then the front, by pushing down on the bumpers at their centers. Release the bumpers on a downstroke after about 5 cycles. On all models, except Valiant, use the direct reading height and level gauge you've been using. It measures difference in height between the lower ball joint and the underside of the lower control arm torsion bar housing. For the Valiant, there's a new height and level gauge. It clamps around the torsion bar housing just behind the lower control arms. After jouncing the car, make sure the gauge is properly installed. Take your readings, and if necessary, adjust the torsion bar anchor bolts with the gauge in position. There are new height specifications, of course. On all sedan and coupe models except Valiant, front suspension height should be 2 inches plus or minus 1/8 inch. On suburban models and cars with heavy-duty springs, except Valiant, it should be 2 3/8 inches plus or minus 1/8 inch. On Valiant, the height should be 1 3/4 inches on both sedan and suburban models, plus or minus 1/8 inch. Allowable difference between left and right side on all models is 1/8 inch. Get it?
Got it. 2 3/8, and 1 3/4 on the Valiants.
Good. Now suppose one side isn't up to specifications, or there's more than an 1/8 inch difference between the sides.
Why, I'd tighten or loosen the adjusting bolts at both torsion bar anchors. Because I know that adjusting one side throws the other side off, so you'll have to adjust both sides.
That's the stuff. And you probably remember about making new measurements after each adjustment, eh?
Oh, sure. I'd recheck the adjustment by jouncing the car, front and rear, and by taking new readings.
Now, be sure the gauge is still properly installed. It could have moved when you jounced the car.
That's a good point, Tech. Did you notice, Wayne, the torsion bar anchors are inside the frame sub-assembly's rear crossmember. The anchor adjusting bolts are located closer to the center of the car instead of toward the outside.
We still turn them the same way, though, don't we?
Yeah, clockwise to increase height, counterclockwise to decrease height. No change in that. Another thing, use some penetrating lubricant on the threads before you adjust the anchor bolts. And if it takes more than 200 foot-pounds to turn a bolt, know what to do?
Yep. I'd let the front wheel hang down to relieve some of the load on the torsion bar. Then I'd replace the anchor bolt and swivel.
That's right. And the limit on the Valiant is only 150 foot-pounds before you'd replace the T-bolt and nut.
Don't forget to pack the rubber seal at the torsion bar rear anchor with multi-purpose chassis lubricant to guard against rust and corrosion.
Okay, Tech, will do. Anything else?
Yeah, Wayne. On the Valiant, the lower ball joint is a compression type rather than a tension type joint. The ball stud attaches to the lower control arm. The ball socket part attaches to the steering knuckle arm and support. Because the joint is a compression type, and because it uses a balloon type seal that puts no preload on the ball feels loose in the socket when car weight is off the front wheels. If you didn't know that, you might think the ball joint was far too loose and needed replacement.
In other words, you're asking me to inspect for looseness in Valiant ball joints only when the car weight is on the wheels.
Right. But that's a good thing to do on all cars, Wayne.
Okay, that's the way I'll do it.
Attaboy. Now, if you want to remove a Valiant torsion bar, use this special clamp-on tool to drive the bar out through the rear anchor. Never pound on the bar or you'll be asking for trouble.
All right, Scott. I'll watch that.
Whatever you do, measure and correct front end height before you check caster and camber. New specifications apply, of course, and while the changes are not great, they're mighty important. A car with the front end properly adjusted will handle better, brake more effectively, and deliver more miles from a set of tires.
What are the new specifications, Scott?
Well, we've got to get caster closer this year. On a car with power steering, caster should be a positive 3/4 degree plus or minus 1/2. With a positive 3/4 degree preferred. This applies to both left and right wheels on all models. On a car with manual steering, caster should be negative 1/2 degree plus or minus 1/2. A negative 1/2 degree is preferred.
Let me interrupt your caster conversation for 1 minute, Scott. I've got to ask somebody to please turn this record. The needle's right on the last groove.
Well, I'm okay on the new caster specifications, but how about those on the Valiant?
Same thing, Wayne. The new caster readings apply to all models.
Tech's right. With power steering, positive 3/4 degree caster is preferred because it increases directional stability. It also helps the wheels return after they roll around a turn. On cars with manual steering, negative 1/2 degree caster is preferred because it reduces steering effort, especially at low speeds. Now, if a car with power steering had too much positive caster, it could show up as a shimmy, especially under high passenger loading. Too much positive caster on a manual steering car would show up as hard steering.
I see. How about a car where caster is unequal?
Unequal caster makes the car tend to drift toward the side with the least amount of positive caster. If there's a lot of difference, the car may pull to one side when brakes are applied. It's more apt to happen when one wheel has negative caster and the other has positive caster. The car will tend to pull toward the negative side when brakes are applied.
Okay, Scott. I'll be sure that caster angles are right. How about camber?
Well, there are new camber specifications, too, and they apply to all of the new cars. On the left wheel, camber should be positive 3/8 degree plus or minus 1/4 degree. A positive 3/8 degree is preferred. On the right wheel, camber angle should be a positive 1/8 degree plus or minus 1/4. A positive 1/8 degree is preferred. Proper camber is a must for good tire life.
Incidentally, Wayne, while caster and camber specifications are new, you still use the same method of adjustment. But in case you're rusty on it, Scott can give you a reminder.
I sure can. Listen, turning each cam bolt an equal amount, but in opposite directions, moves the ball joint end of the upper control arm fore or aft. This increases or decreases caster. Turning both the front and rear cam adjusting bolts an equal amount in the same direction moves the upper control arm in or out. This increases or decreases camber.
All right, Scott. I remember. Valiant, I suppose, won't give me trouble.
I don't think so. On the Valiant, incidentally, you reach over the tire or from underneath to adjust caster and camber. You can't get at the cam bolts and lock nuts by way of the engine compartment. Another thing, the front cam bolt on the Valiant must be installed from the rear, and the rear bolt from the front. Cam bolt heads must be next to each other between the front and rear upper control arm bushings. If you install them any other way, you won't be able to adjust cams and tighten the lock nuts correctly. They should be tightened to 65 foot-pounds to prevent cam slippage and changes in a carefully set adjustment.
Okay, Scott. I'll keep an eye out for that.
Good. Let's talk now about steering axis inclination. This angle is designed into the steering knuckle and is not adjustable. But measure the angle to detect bent parts, or if you have trouble meeting camber specifications.
What should that angle measure, Scott?
6.5 degrees plus or minus 1 degree on all models except Valiant. On Valiant, 7.5 degrees plus or minus 1 degree.
1 degree difference. Okay, Scott, I'll keep that angle in mind.
Fine, Wayne. It's important. I'll bet many people don't realize that steering axis inclination contributes more to directional stability than caster does. Actually, that's why negative caster can be used with manual steering to reduce turning effort and still not sacrifice directional stability.
That's another good reason why you should never try changing caster angles to improve steering until you know steering axis inclination is correct.
Good advice, Tech. Our suspension engineers know what they're doing. They figured the relationship between caster and steering axis inclination angles to provide the best combination of steering characteristics.
Well, suppose the angles check out and a car still steers poorly.
That's a fair question. But in a case like that, I'd look for loose, worn, or binding suspension or steering parts. I'd also look for loose rear spring U-bolts. Here's something else. Noises annoy car owners more than anything else. In our front suspension and steering systems, we've taken a lot of pains to reduce possible noise by using rubber bushings. You'll find rubber isolation used at the strut pivot, the lower and upper control arm pivots, and there are jounce and rebound bumpers. In addition, there's rubber at the idler arm, at the center link, at shock absorber mountings, at sway bar mountings, and so on. As a check against noise, all points should be inspected occasionally. For example, on early production cars, you might find that threads on the lower shock absorber mounting bolt are not long enough. The nut will bottom on the threads, and even though you tighten the nut to the specified 55 foot-pounds, the mounting may still be loose and cause noise.
It'll sound like a faulty shock, but don't be fooled.
Right. So before you replace the shock, remove the nut and install a flat washer as a spacer to keep the nut from bottoming. Be sure the rear shock upper mounting is tight in the body, too.
That's an easy fix, all right. Got any more?
Well, make sure the bushing at the front of the strut is in good condition. Also, see if you get exactly 40 foot-pounds when you put the torque wrench on the strut nut. Another thing, remember that rubber bushed parts must be assembled and tightened to specified torque while they're in a normal driving position.
Well, how about an example?
Sure. Take the lower control arm bushing. You must tighten it to specified torque after you install it and while the control arms are in normal curb height position. If you don't do this, you'll preload the bushings. Let's say the suspension assembly hangs down when you tighten the bushing shaft. That will preload the bushing in rebound position. The ride will be affected. Also, the life of the bushing will be reduced. Here's another example. If you tighten the idler arm bushing with the wheels turned, it preloads the bushing in that position. So, tighten rubber bushed steering parts with wheels in straight ahead position. A bushing tightened in a stressed position can cause a drift, unequal steering effort, and can affect returnability. Get the picture?
Yep. I'll see that all parts are in normal driving position before I tighten rubber bushed mountings.
If you have to assemble new rubber suspension parts, use only clear water to help put them together. No other lubricant is recommended.
Clear water only. Okay. Now, how about toe in and toe out?
Nothing special, Wayne. You still adjust toe in to 1/8 inch and do it the way you always have. A few reminders, though, might be helpful to you. Center the steering wheel. Keep the tie rod clamp bolts below the tie rods so they'll clear other suspension and body frame parts when the road wheels are in any position. Before you tighten the clamp bolts, rotate the tie rod and its ball ends so all free motion between ball studs and sockets is taken up in the same direction. This will permit ample tie rod movement on turns and will prevent any binding at the sockets.
I can use those tips, Scott. I know what toe in means to tire life. How about toe out on turns?
That's built in, Wayne, and can't be adjusted. Measure it, though, to be sure there are no bent steering parts. On the Valiant, when the inside wheel is turned 20 degrees, the outside wheel angle should be 17 1/2 degrees. On all other models, the outside angle should be 18 1/2 degrees, plus or minus 1 degree on both outside angles.
Okay, Scott. Anything else?
Well, don't overlook inspecting the rear suspension rubber parts. Rear shock mountings, spring front eye bushings, rear shackles, jounce and carrier nose bumpers, and spring interliners all should be replaced when worn out.
Okay, I get the message.
You've gotten more than that, Wayne. Scott gave you a beautiful rundown on most of the 1960 improvements in our suspension and steering systems. This reference book has even more information you'll find useful. So, add some practice now, and you'll be ready for any suspension or front-end service operation.